July 28, 2018. It's early Saturday morning in Kansas City, Missouri, the Show Me State's largest city.
It's really thriving downtown, so it's a fun place to live. It's a fun place to work.
It's a great place to raise your family.
Kansas City is known for being a good Midwest city. It's in the middle of the map. It's the Heartland.
But even the heartland of America has its fair share of crime.
We have, unfortunately, a large number of homicides within the city.
And in the pre-dawn hours that morning, the grim tally goes up again.
Somebody, what happened?
911 received a frantic call from a woman.
A young woman was found in the yard of her grandmother's house.
When police respond, they find a grieving family gathered outside the house.
There was a young woman laid out on the grass, and she was covered in blood.
Guys, go ahead and step back for a minute. Let my partner work on her, okay?
Do you know her? This is your need?
I can only imagine the fear, the trauma that immediately set in when you see your loved one laid out on the ground.
What happened and how long she'd been there isn't clear.
A family member had found her lying motionless in the yard, moments before the 911 call came in.
Andrew.
Came in there and said we found her out in the front yard.
She had stab wounds all over her body, from her head to her neck, her chest, her stomach, her arms.
Ear suction in the chest.
But when the EMTs check for vital signs, it's clear the victim is already gone.
Unfortunately, as much as they tried, there was nothing that they could do.
All anyone knows for sure is the identity of the victim.
What's her name? Andrea Vine.
Life had been a series of challenges for 27-year-old DeAndrea Vine.
DeAndrea had some struggles that she had to deal with.
From childhood, DeAndrea had suffered from epilepsy and associated learning disabilities.
Having a learning disability and a chronic illness like epilepsy can be damaging to self-esteem.
Epilepsy or with any type of cognitive delays can make it very hard to function in a school setting.
She was in special education classes.
She did not let that stop her. She was a very determined soul.
But there was one part of her life where DeAndrea didn't struggle.
DeAndrea was quite popular in school. She had a lot of friends, got a lot of attention.
And soon after high school, she attracted a different kind of attention.
At 18, DeAndrea met a man who she developed a long-term relationship with.
His name was Marcus Williams.
How you doing?
When you're young, you're excited to know that you have someone that likes you.
You have a young lady dealing with the difficulties of feeling different, and now you have a young man expressing interest in her.
DeAndrea felt like the Marcus is different. It gives me hope. It reminds me that I'm safe and everything is better.
Over the next few years, what started as a teenage crush turned into a family.
They had 4 children together, and they were happy and making things work.
She was loving her kids, and he helped with the kids as well.
She was always trying to do the right thing and always trying to be a good mother.
But love couldn't overcome all the problems DeAndrea faced.
With motherhood, you don't always get it right. It's very, very challenging.
Eventually, DeAndrea's children were taken into foster care by the state.
A doctor alerted Child Protective Services because he suspected Marcus may have physically abused one of the children.
DeAndrea couldn't believe it.
It made her mad and frustrated.
DeAndrea was adamant that Marcus would never hurt her children.
They didn't even determine he actually did it. So they just had him go to anger management classes.
Getting their kids back would be an even greater ordeal.
And having to have this interaction with children's services, I would imagine that posed as a difficult time for her.
For any mother, losing your children is not easy. It's not something that you've ever planned for.
Worse was to come.
In 2017, worn down by the custody struggles and his battle over the abuse allegations, Marcus committed suicide.
I can only imagine how DeAndrea felt now that she doesn't have her children living with her and the love of her life has taken his own life.
But she wasn't alone.
She had a very strong family support group who were very lovely individuals.
With her family's tireless support, DeAndrea managed to get her children out of foster care.
We had to go through a lot of, allegations and everything to get them back.
And she wasn't going to let anything stop her from rebuilding her family.
DeAndrea took a job at Walmart, which was very difficult for her with the epilepsy, but she was determined to get things back on track and to provide for her family.
She's a fighter. It takes a strong woman to be able to have these learning disabilities, health issues, be able to get up and go to work every day, to provide for yourself and show the courts that you are capable of being able to take care of your children.
But now, a year after Marcus's suicide, DeAndrea's family has called 911 after finding her bloody body in the yard outside her grandmother's house.
She was lying on the ground, wrapped in a blanket, bleeding from multiple stab wounds.
But when EMTs remove the blanket, they uncover a possible motive for the crime.
They discovered that DeAndrea's underwear was missing.
This could have been a sexual assault.
A year after the father of her 4 children committed suicide, 27-year-old DeAndrea Vine was rebuilding her life.
With help from her mother and grandmother, DeAndrea was able to get her children out of foster care and back with her family.
She went and obtained a job at Walmart, which, given her epilepsy, could present as a difficult thing to do. But she took the challenge head on.
She continued to move forward with her life after all the tragedy that she had experienced.
But now DeAndrea's children have suffered another tragic loss.
Early that morning, DeAndrea's cousin found her bloody body lying in the grass in front of her grandmother's house.
Hey guys, go ahead and step back for a minute. Let my partner work, okay?
She was stabbed multiple times all over her body. Her face, her neck, her chest, her stomach, her arms.
And that may not have been the only horror she suffered.
DeAndrea was found with no pants and no underwear on, which led them to believe that she was sexually assaulted.
While it will take an autopsy to determine if that's the case, detectives arrive and are able to determine where the deadly attack began.
There was a trail of blood leading from the front yard all the way to a white van that was parked outside of the house.
There was a large amount of blood on the driveway just outside of the passenger side.
When detectives checked inside the minivan, they found that it was covered in blood.
They also find her cell phone in the van, and there's a receipt on the floorboard.
The receipt contains what appears to be an important clue.
We got a shoe print.
On this receipt was a blood-stamped shoe print. It was a big clue for detectives because she wasn't wearing shoes.
And it wasn't just any shoe print either.
It was the Vans brand of shoe, which has a very distinct print on the bottom.
Looking to narrow things down even further, detectives turn to DeAndrea's family.
Ms. Vine lived with her children and some of her other family members in the home where this occurred.
So sorry about your loss this evening. Why don't you tell me what happened?
Most of the family members at the scene were either too young or too distraught to interview.
However, DeAndrea's uncle does have some useful information for detectives.
Her uncle arrived home around 1 a.m. and he actually seen DeAndrea outside talking to a younger male.
She was sitting right here in the shed with some of blood something with a backpack on. I remember that.
Okay. But he said when he parked the car and walked up to the house, this man was gone. He disappeared already.
He told them he never really got a good look at him.
All he can say for sure is that he was young and wearing a backpack.
When you say young, are we talking like young or like 18? Teenage?
DeAndrea's uncle says he assumed the young man was a friend of his niece's.
Hey, how you doing, Nathan?
Yeah.
He did speak with DeAndrea and everything seemed fine.
You okay?
Yeah.
I'm all right? Okay.
He didn't think anything of it, nothing suspicious, and he went inside to go to sleep.
Until 3 hours later, when DeAndrea's cousin burst into their grandmother's house.
My brother's kid, he came in at 4 o'clock that morning, and he said he seen her out there, blood everywhere.
However, when the detectives asked who might have wanted to harm DeAndrea, her family members had no idea.
Is there anyone that you can think of that she's having any arguments or beef with right now? No?
All right.
Thank you guys for your cooperation.
After talking to the family, the detectives fan out across the neighborhood, looking for possible witnesses.
They go door to door on a mission to find out what happens to DeAndrea.
One neighbor does describe something unusual.
There was a woman across the street that happened to see a man driving, and he stopped and asked her, "Hey, did you order an Uber?"
Hey, excuse me. Did you order an Uber?
No, I didn't. She explained to the Uber driver that she hadn't requested a ride, and he drove off.
Okay, do you know this time number? That was at 1:48.
Then, as she was heading inside, she heard a commotion across the street.
They're arguing and fighting. It sounded kind of serious. So I was like, okay, well, let me listen a little bit just because I'm nosy too. So I'm listening and I hear a girl, she sounded like she was saying, okay, I'm sorry, stop, I won't do it again. So that's when I was like, are you okay?
Hey, is everything okay over there?
She had actually called out to see if somebody needed help, and then she didn't hear anything else.
But she says she never saw DeAndrea lying in the grass, covered in blood.
There were several cars parked on the street in front of the residence, which was obscuring her view of the body.
But the neighbor says she did see someone.
A gentleman walked to the side of the van, and he got like a bag or something out of the van.
What kind of bag? Like a backpack or a...
I know it wasn't like a Walmart bag or a trash bag, but it was a bag.
She didn't have a lot of details that she could give detectives about who the person was.
As far as like making out his facial features and stuff, I didn't really get a very good look at him.
Okay.
I could tell he was black.
Did you see maybe how old he looked?
No older than 25.
Detectives suspect this was the same person DeAndrea had been talking to earlier that night.
Her uncle had already told detectives that the person she had been speaking with was wearing a backpack and appeared to be pretty young.
But it's not until DeAndrea's sister arrives at the scene that they get their first clue to his identity.
She was telling me about this guy she worked with.
There was this guy at Walmart that was flirting with DeAndrea.
In fact, DeAndrea's sister thought that they had done more than just flirt.
Do you know his name?
No, I just thought he was really young.
After family members found DeAndrea Vine stabbed to death in her grandmother's front yard, her sister has given detectives a clue to the identity of the man she was seen with earlier that evening.
DeAndrea's sister informs them that DeAndrea may have been talking or messing around with a young person at work.
That gave detectives something to work with as far as who this individual she was speaking to might be.
Do you know his name?
No, I just thought he was really young.
So were they like dating or just kind of flirting at work?
They were just messing around. I'm not really sure what they were doing.
Her sister didn't know much about the dynamic of the relationship.
But she does know that DeAndrea enjoyed the attention.
I would imagine it would be very difficult being a single mother raising 4 children, maybe not much time for dating. And so it would feel great to have someone show interest.
Aren't you supposed to be in the stocking?
Yeah, but, I just came to say hi.
It probably just made her feel like the most special woman in this world.
However, according to her sister, there was one big drawback to DeAndrea's new suitor.
Her sister stated that he was only 17.
So there's a chance it was just flirting?
I just know she had a problem with it.
He's not 18 yet, and she is 27. There could be legal repercussions.
If DeAndrea had rejected the teenager, could that have led to a deadly attack?
The police suspected that she'd been sexually assaulted, so there was a possible scenario where the coworker had forced himself on DeAndrea, and the violence escalated when she fought back.
There were a large number of stab wounds, which is usually indicative of someone who knows their attacker. There's usually some sort of a relationship to garner that much rage.
The morning after DeAndrea's murder, the detectives attempt to track down her would-be boyfriend.
Detectives head to Walmart to find out who this 17-year-old is.
While talking to DeAndrea's manager, they learn that the young man is most likely 17-year-old Xavier McDowell.
The manager tells them that he actually sees DeAndrea and Xavier a lot in the break room.
And according to the manager, they weren't just hanging out.
The supervisor said that they had to break them up from making out in the break room.
He would have to tell them, hey, you guys have to stop and go back to work.
Their behavior was inappropriate, but there were no indications of any sort of harassment going on.
It was just that she was engaged in sort of a workplace romance with this young man.
I'll give you his address.
But the relationship between Xavier and DeAndrea confirmed. Investigators head to his parents' house to question him.
We're looking for Xavier McDowell. We just need to ask him a few questions about one of his co-workers.
Xavier?
Yes, sir.
We need to ask you a few questions about DeAndrea Vine.
Sure. I heard about what happened, but I just can't believe it.
When they talked to Xavier, he seemed very sad, very affected by the news that she had passed away.
She was such a nice person.
During the interview, Xavier is upfront about his relationship with DeAndrea.
He did indicate that they had a sexual relationship, but there wasn't much other than that sexual relationship between the two of them.
So no plans for the future?
Nothing like that. We're just having fun,
He called it a lust relationship. He said they had only been together 2 times.
They met up at a hotel.
Why a hotel?
She lived with her people, and we couldn't meet here. So.
Xavier lived with his mom, so his place was out too.
He informed detectives that the last time they had sex was about a month ago.
When was the last time you saw her?
It was yesterday at work.
He told detectives they had been on the same shift at Walmart the night before.
They didn't talk because things were so busy at work.
He was only able to wave hello to her.
What time did you get home from work?
10. My brother had picked me up.
Xavier told investigators that his brother had picked him up for work and that he had stayed in for the rest of the night.
And Mom, you can confirm that he was here all night?
No, I can't. I worked the graveyard shift and I didn't get in until 5 a.m. this morning.
Okay. Thank you for your time.
Was it possible he'd slipped out later that evening and went to see DeAndrea?
Detectives were aware that Xavier didn't drive, and he lived about 3 miles away from DeAndrea.
Detectives doubt that he walked.
However, one of DeAndrea's neighbors did tell detectives there was an Uber in the area around the time of the murder.
They needed to track down this Uber driver.
Detectives also need to see who DeAndrea had been in contact with on the night of her murder.
Detectives subpoena records for DeAndrea's cell phone.
Whether DeAndrea met up with Xavier or someone else that night, her phone records may show who she had talked to on the phone or exchanged text messages with before they got together.
But detectives are still working those leads when they're contacted by another of DeAndrea's co-workers.
Homicide.
The woman called police and told them that she had some potentially important information.
I don't know if it has anything to do with what happened, but she told me something.
Ms. Vine had communicated that she may be pregnant.
Detectives investigating the brutal murder of DeAndrea Vine have learned that the 27-year-old may have been expecting her 5th child.
According to a co-worker, DeAndrea had told her that she was pregnant.
The news takes detectives by surprise.
None of DeAndrea's family had said anything about her being pregnant.
Is she pregnant? You don't think so? Okay, I just want to make sure.
Of course, DeAndrea may have had her reasons for wanting to keep the pregnancy quiet.
Did she say who the father was?
No.
Detectives suspect the answer may be DeAndrea's 17-year-old co-worker, Xavier McDowell.
Xavier admitted that DeAndre and him had been intimate with each other on 2 separate occasions.
So she didn't say it was Xavier's?
No. I kind of just assumed it was.
Associates from her workplace knew that she was involved in a romantic relationship with Xavier.
If he's the father, does that also mean that he's her killer?
He was only 17, so he might not have been happy about becoming a father.
Did DeAndrea ever talk about possibly ending the pregnancy?
No, but that wouldn't be like her either.
She was a mother of 4 who adored her children.
Detectives also have to consider the possibility that the baby wasn't Xavier's.
If DeAndrea had been hooking up with someone else, jealousy could come into play.
Maybe she was the victim of a love triangle.
Did DeAndrea ever talk about possibly seeing someone else?
As far as I know, it was only Xavier.
Love triangle or not, when detectives received DeAndrea's autopsy report, it's clear whoever killed her was enraged.
When investigators got the autopsy results from the medical examiner's office, the first thing that stood out was the sheer violence of the attack.
It was well over 30 stab wounds.
And that's only a fraction of the injuries cataloged by the medical examiner.
The stab wound is something that actually penetrates into the body, and then there's incised wounds, which are more of a superficial cut, and she had dozens of both on her body.
She also had defensive wounds to her hands and arms.
DeAndrea fought desperately with her attacker.
These type of stabbing cases, there's a lot of rage involved and just a lot of severe injury, which unfortunately make the victim's demise just so much more brutal.
And there is one more thing that the autopsy makes crystal clear.
She was not, in fact, pregnant.
It's potentially a bombshell piece of information.
Was DeAndrea simply mistaken when she told her co-worker she was pregnant?
Perhaps more importantly for the investigation, what had she told Xavier?
For Xavier to have a motive, it wasn't necessary for her to actually be pregnant. He just needed to think she was.
When detectives received DeAndrea's phone records, they combed through call logs and text messages looking for the answer.
The records showed that Xavier did reach out to DeAndrea in hours before the murder.
They found several phone calls from Xavier to DeAndrea.
DeAndrea did not answer any of his calls.
The detectives have no way of knowing exactly why Xavier was calling DeAndrea, but their text messages give them a pretty good idea.
There were text messages where detectives saw that the two of them, just a few days before her death, discussed a possible pregnancy.
Xavier texted DeAndrea and said, "Oh my God, stop telling me that stuff.
Don't tell me you're pregnant."
Xavier was not happy.
Could he have been desperate enough to kill?
Detectives investigating the murder of DeAndrea Vine have learned that the mother of 4 wasn't pregnant. But it appears DeAndrea's co-worker turned lover, Xavier McDowell, didn't know that.
Based on the text messages between Xavier and DeAndrea, he was panicking about the prospect of becoming a father.
Being 17 and being told that you're getting ready to be a father, that has to be scary, especially if you're not in a place financially to support a family.
However, tying Xavier directly to the murder proves more difficult.
The pregnancy gave him a motive, but none of the eyewitnesses that night were able to give detectives more than a vague description.
One neighbor saw a man bend down, pick up a backpack, and then run off.
DeAndrea's uncle had also seen a young man with a backpack talking to DeAndrea on the porch.
Neither of the witnesses got a good look at the young man, but detectives suspect there may be a way to identify him.
According to DeAndrea's neighbor, there had been an Uber driver in the neighborhood at the time of the murder.
Excuse me, did you order an Uber?
No, I didn't.
The neighbor told police he'd been trying to locate the person who'd called the ride.
Now detectives are looking for the Uber driver to see if Xavier was a passenger.
It's important to put Xavier at the scene during the time of the murder.
Detectives contact the rideshare company and are eventually able to track down the driver who was in DeAndrea's neighborhood the night of the murder.
Hello?
He said that he was dispatched to that address around 1:30 that morning on Saturday.
But the rider wasn't there.
I didn't actually pick up anybody. Why is that? While I was waiting, I heard screaming. There's a woman screaming.
The driver says he never saw the woman, but he did see a man.
He said that he'd seen a man running away.
He ended up getting scared and left.
Did you see what this guy looked like?
I don't know, it was dark. I didn't really get a good look at him.
What about the ride request? Was there a name on it?
Yeah, usually, but this time it just said X.
The rider had only used an initial for his Uber profile, and the card linked to the account was a prepaid debit card, so it didn't have a name on it either.
However, the driver does have some useful information for detectives.
The destination for the requested ride was Raytown South High School.
Raytown High School is really close to Xavier's house.
Okay. Thank you.
But it still isn't enough to put Xavier at the crime scene.
So they went back to Walmart that went through hours and hours of surveillance footage of inside the store.
The surveillance footage captures both DeAndrea and Xavier at work, just a few hours before the murder.
Just as Xavier told the police, they didn't really interact on the video.
They did wave at each other.
But that isn't all the video shows.
Hold it. Go back.
But you see something?
Yeah, right there.
Xavier was wearing Vans.
That was the same type of shoe as the bloody footprint left on the receipt detectives found at the scene.
It was very clear that it was the same brand of shoes.
It's the extra piece of evidence the detectives need.
They proceed with an arrest warrant to take Xavier in.
When detectives sit down with Xavier, he agrees to make a statement.
He started out by repeating what he said to police in his first interview, that he and DeAndrea were just together for casual sex.
I wasn't really in love, and I knew it wasn't supposed to go any further.
But there was a complication, or so he thought.
She told me that I had got her pregnant,
Oh, she did?
Xavier said that DeAndrea told him about the pregnancy a few days before the murder.
Did you have any reason to not believe her, or?
No, because I know what I did, and I know I should have worn that condom.
Xavier also admits that he wasn't happy about the idea of being a father.
Did you want her to not have a baby?
Yeah, at first, but she wouldn't agree to anything like that, so I can't force someone to want to get rid of a baby.
Right.
Not that detectives believe him.
They started pressing Xavier about the night of the murder, but he was still sticking to his original story.
Xavier reported that he came home from work at about 10 o'clock.
Okay, so you go straight there. And then you're there until you go to bed, you said midnight?
He denied going to her house that night.
It looks like you called her about 4 times, between 12 and 1 a.m. Did you do that?
I did call her.
Right. Okay. Did you go over to her house that night? That's just not true, man. Ask yourself this. Would I be asking you if you went over there that night? Would you be sitting here if we didn't know that you went over there that night? Okay.
He then confesses that he was there that night.
Xavier said he went to DeAndrea's house that night only looking to hook up.
So you were going over there for your booty call. What time is that?
That was around 2 in the morning.
But there was one problem.
There were so many people at the house that they couldn't have any privacy inside.
She didn't want to wake her kids up or anybody, so we had sex in the backyard.
Okay. What else happened?
Then she went into the front and sat down where there's some chairs, and then I went home.
Detectives know that's a lie.
We found the driver that you originally called and didn't get in the vehicle.
He saw you running off, man.
You heard the screams.
Sensing that they've backed Xavier into a corner, detectives keep up the pressure.
There's no way to get around this stuff, man. I'm telling you, there's just no way.
But that didn't stop Xavier from trying.
We didn't have sex in the back.
Okay.
We had sex in the car.
Which car?
The van.
He got in the passenger seat. DeAndrea got on top of him. They did have sexual intercourse.
But according to Xavier, while they were having sex, things took an unexpected turn.
She went crazy.
He said that she pulled out a knife and started to attack him.
She tried to kill me.
Xavier McDowell has admitted that it was him in the minivan with DeAndrea Vine on the night she died. But he says he's no murderer.
Did you plan to go over there and kill her?
What were you planning to do?
Just talk to her?
Sex.
He said that while they were having sex, she pulled out a knife.
I saw her lift up a knife.
You saw her lift a knife up while she's on top of you?
Yeah.
He says what happened next is mostly a blur.
He was able to grab the knife, but it was only reflex.
And my hand went like this, and that's how the collar would cut a little bit.
Right.
But she didn't really get to cut me.
DeAndrea wasn't so lucky.
Xavier says that he, in self-defense, stabbed her in the neck.
But that wasn't the end of it.
He said that she started to swing at him with her fist.
She was screaming at me.
So he continued to stab her.
How many times did you stab her then?
I don't remember.
He said that she then exited the van.
And then she's on like the ground.
But DeAndrea's ordeal was far from over.
He said he had to stab her even more because she had to die.
You were scared of getting in trouble?
Yeah.
Gotcha. So that's why you killed her?
Yeah.
He had to make sure she was dead. That was his logic.
Then, according to Xavier, he'd gone back to the van and grabbed his backpack before returning to where DeAndrea lay bleeding in the grass.
Why'd you come back? Because I didn't know if she was dead or not.
He then stabbed her a few more times to make sure she was actually dead.
Finally, sure that DeAndrea was dead, or at least dying, Xavier made his escape.
I hopped over fences. I ran.
Then he called another Uber for a ride home.
Once he got home, he was able to take off all of his clothes, clean himself up, and then burn his clothes outside in the backyard.
Xavier's story fits at least some of the evidence at the crime scene, but not all.
The physical evidence and the nature of the injury to Ms. Vine's body were not consistent with his version of what happened.
You went over there to stab her. That's exactly what it looks like.
You're not defending yourself. That's BS. We know that.
We know that that's not true.
A realization that sinks in once detectives step out of the interview room.
Lord, please help me. I'm hurt. My life is over. It's over. It's over. My life is over.
Xavier may be a killer, but he was also a scared 17-year-old kid.
And he's going to jail.
Our man standing up.
But Xavier will never stand trial.
Xavier agrees to plead guilty to second-degree murder. He actually admitted that he was the one that had the knife that night.
He said, I didn't tell the truth in the beginning. DeAndrea did not attack me. I actually attacked her.
Still, parts of Xavier's story were true.
He did go over there under the pretext of a booty call.
I think what really happened was they probably did engage in sex in the minivan.
But when it was over, Xavier confronted DeAndrea about the baby she claimed to be carrying.
DeAndrea really thought she was pregnant, and Xavier was scared to step into parenthood.
Listen, DeAndrea, we have to talk about this baby.
I already told you I'm not arguing about this anymore.
He admitted that he was very angry about the pregnancy.
So angry that he became violent.
Xavier, stop!
He started stabbing her in the neck and throat area in the minivan. She was able to get out and try to escape.
But she didn't get far, and Xavier was right behind her.
No, Xavier, please, please!
Then suffered a large number of stab wounds, which would be consistent with somebody likely standing over top of her and stabbing her because he wanted to make sure that she was actually, in fact, dead.
Although at his sentencing hearing, when the judge asks Xavier if he has anything to say for himself, he doesn't keep silent.
He did express remorse at the sentencing hearing. I do think he was remorseful. He was very young when this happened.
Xavier will be far older when he finishes paying for what he'd done.
The judge sentences Xavier to 23 years in prison.
But is the sentence good enough?
This is a mother that was taken from her children, so is this justice? Absolutely not.
What's worse, DeAndrea's kids lost their mother just 1 year after their father's tragic suicide.
Which means that much like their mother, DeAndrea's children will face a lifetime of challenges.
You just have to feel so sorry for these children. My heart goes out to them.
I hope for her kids that they find some peace.
And that's just a void that family can never quite fill as hard as they try. And it's a huge loss.
I'm still trying to get through the storms. I don't know where I'm going. I don't know where I'm ending up. But, I have faith.
On the evening of December 24, 2002, in the quiet suburban city of Modesto, California, Christmas lights flickered gently across neatly trimmed lawns, wrapping entire neighborhoods in a warm, almost deceptive sense of peace. Families were inside wrapping last-minute gifts, kitchens smelled of cinnamon and roasted meat, and the world, for a brief moment, seemed to slow down just enough to believe that nothing bad could ever happen here. But behind one of those glowing windows, a disappearance was already unfolding. A young pregnant woman named Lacey Peterson was gone. At first, nobody understood what that meant. Gone, in a small town like Modesto, doesn't immediately translate to danger. It can mean a delayed visit, a forgotten appointment, a phone left on silent. Life is ordinary here. Predictable. Safe, even. That was the illusion. Lacey Peterson was 27 years old, 8 months pregnant, and preparing for her first child. Her life, from the outside, looked like a carefully arranged photograph. A young teacher, well liked by her students, known for her gentle demeanor and soft smile. Her pregnancy had been the center of her world in recent months, and those close to her described a quiet excitement building beneath her calm exterior, like a secret she could barely contain. That morning, she had been seen doing something completely ordinary. She walked her dog in the neighborhood, moving slowly with the weight of late pregnancy, stopping to talk to neighbors, taking in the cool December air. There was nothing unusual in her behavior. Nothing at all that would suggest this day would end differently from any other day in her routine. And yet, by the time evening fell, she was no longer reachable. Her husband, Scott Peterson, would later say he had gone fishing alone that morning at the Barkley Marina. He said he left early, drove west toward the water, and spent the day away from home. When he returned, Lacey was gone. Her car was in the driveway. Her keys were not where she usually left them. Her shoes, her purse, the small details of her daily life, all still inside the house. But she was not. At first, it seemed like the kind of mystery that might resolve itself quickly. Maybe she had gone to visit her mother. Maybe she had driven out to buy last-minute Christmas supplies. Maybe she had simply taken a walk farther than usual and lost track of time. But as hours passed, then night fell, and then Christmas Eve deepened into Christmas morning, the absence began to feel heavier. More permanent. When Lacey's family realized they could not reach her, concern turned into panic. Her mother called repeatedly. Her friends searched their memories for any clue she might have left behind. The house in Modesto, once a symbol of domestic calm, became the center of something far more unsettling. Something wrong had happened there, or around there, or to her, and no one yet knew what shape that wrongness had taken. Scott Peterson, when contacted, appeared calm. Almost too calm, some would later say. He told people his wife was missing, that she had likely gone for a walk and not returned. He presented himself as confused, concerned, but composed. A man trying to hold himself together in the face of sudden chaos. But even in those early hours, before the world had fully turned its attention to Modesto, there were small fractures beginning to appear in the story. Neighbors remembered seeing Lacey earlier that morning, but no one recalled seeing her after midday. Her phone activity was limited. Her presence, once so visible in the rhythm of the neighborhood, simply stopped. As if someone had reached in and turned off a light, without anyone noticing the moment it went dark. Police were eventually called. At first, they treated it as a missing persons case, one of many that come and go without resolution. But something about this one quickly escalated. The pregnancy changed everything. An 8-month pregnant woman does not simply vanish without urgency. The clock was no longer measured in days. It was measured in hours. Search teams were organized. Volunteers arrived. Helicopters swept over the city and surrounding farmland. Officers knocked on doors, retraced her steps, asked the same questions over and over again in slightly different ways, hoping something would shift. But the answers remained stubbornly empty. And then there was Scott Peterson. From the outside, he looked like the grieving husband. He spoke to reporters with a controlled sadness, describing Lacey as loving, kind, someone who would never willingly disappear without telling anyone. He stood in front of cameras and asked for help finding her, his voice steady, his posture composed. The kind of man people instinctively wanted to believe. But investigations rarely rely on appearances alone. As detectives began reconstructing the timeline of that day, inconsistencies emerged. Scott's account of where he had been began to shift in small, but noticeable ways. Details about his fishing trip did not align perfectly with what was later confirmed by records and witnesses. The story that had seemed simple at first began to develop edges that didn't fit together cleanly. Then came something even more disturbing. Before Lacey's body had been found, before there was any physical confirmation of her fate, Scott Peterson reportedly told others that she was gone. Not missing. Not lost. Gone. The word carried a weight that investigators could not ignore. It suggested certainty where there should have been uncertainty. It suggested knowledge of something that had not yet been discovered. At the same time, another narrative began forming quietly in the background of the investigation, one that had nothing to do with fishing or missing persons reports. It involved another life Scott Peterson had been living, separate from the image of the devoted husband. A woman named Amber Fry entered the story unexpectedly. She had met Scott without knowing he was married. To her, he presented himself as single, interested, available. Their relationship developed quickly, almost casually at first, like many modern relationships built on incomplete truths. But when she discovered he was married to a pregnant woman who had just disappeared, everything changed. Instead of walking away completely, she made a decision that would alter the trajectory of the investigation. She agreed to cooperate with law enforcement. From that point on, Amber Fry became a silent witness inside the most intimate space of the case. She recorded conversations with Scott, conversations in which grief was strangely absent, replaced by confusion, detachment, and inconsistency. He spoke to her about Lacey in ways that did not match the public image of a desperate husband searching for his missing wife. His tone often felt disconnected, as if he was speaking about a situation happening far away rather than a tragedy unfolding at the center of his own life. These recordings would later become some of the most critical pieces of evidence in the entire case. Not because they contained explicit admissions, but because they revealed something harder to define. A psychological distance. A lack of alignment between emotion and circumstance. A pattern of speech that raised more questions than it answered. Still, at that moment, nothing was proven. Nothing was resolved. The case remained suspended in uncertainty, balanced between hope and dread. As days turned into weeks, the search for Lacey Peterson intensified. The media arrived in Modesto in waves, transforming quiet streets into a landscape of cameras, microphones, and speculation. The community, once calm and insulated, became the center of national attention. Everyone wanted answers. Everyone wanted resolution. But the most important question remained unanswered. Where was Lacey? And beneath that question, another one slowly began to take shape, darker and more uncomfortable. Not just where she was, but what had happened in the hours when she disappeared from the ordinary rhythm of her life. The investigation was no longer just about a missing woman. It was becoming something far more complex. A story with shifting timelines, hidden relationships, and fragments of behavior that did not fit together in any comforting way. And at the center of it all stood a husband who insisted he had nothing to do with her disappearance, even as the space between what he said and what others were discovering continued to grow wider. Christmas passed. The new year arrived. The lights came down from the houses in Modesto, but the case did not fade with them. Instead, it deepened. The absence at the heart of it became more defined, more haunting. Not just the absence of a person, but the absence of certainty itself. And in that uncertainty, the story of Laci Peterson had already begun its transformation, from a missing persons case into one of the most closely watched criminal investigations in modern American history. No one yet knew how it would end. But the silence she left behind was already speaking louder than anyone expected. On the evening of December 24, 2002, in the quiet suburban city of Modesto, California, Christmas lights flickered gently across neatly trimmed lawns, wrapping entire neighborhoods in a warm, almost deceptive sense of peace. Families were inside wrapping last-minute gifts, kitchens smelled of cinnamon and roasted meat, and the world, for a brief moment, seemed to slow down just enough to believe that nothing bad could ever happen here. But behind one of those glowing windows, a disappearance was already unfolding. A young pregnant woman named Laci Peterson was gone. At first, nobody understood what that meant. Gone, in a small town like Modesto, doesn't immediately translate to danger. It can mean a delayed visit, a forgotten appointment, a phone left on silent. Life is ordinary here. Predictable. Safe, even. That was the illusion. Laci Peterson was 27 years old, 8 months pregnant, and preparing for her first child. Her life, from the outside, looked like a carefully arranged photograph. A young teacher, well liked by her students, known for her gentle demeanor and soft smile. Her pregnancy had been the center of her world in recent months, and those close to her described a quiet excitement building beneath her calm exterior, like a secret she could barely contain. That morning, she had been seen doing something completely ordinary. She walked her dog in the neighborhood, moving slowly with the weight of late pregnancy, stopping to talk to neighbors, taking in the cool December air. There was nothing unusual in her behavior. Nothing at all that would suggest this day would end differently from any other day in her routine. And yet, by the time evening fell, she was no longer reachable. Her husband, Scott Peterson, would later say he had gone fishing alone that morning at the Barkley Marina. He said he left early, drove west toward the water, and spent the day away from home. When he returned, Laci was gone. Her car was in the driveway. Her keys were not where she usually left them. Her shoes, her purse, the small details of her daily life, all still inside the house. But she was not. At first, it seemed like the kind of mystery that might resolve itself quickly. Maybe she had gone to visit her mother. Maybe she had driven out to buy last-minute Christmas supplies. Maybe she had simply taken a walk farther than usual and lost track of time. But as hours passed, then night fell, and then Christmas Eve deepened into Christmas morning, the absence began to feel heavier. More permanent. When Laci's family realized they could not reach her, concern turned into panic. Her mother called repeatedly. Her friends searched their memories for any clue she might have left behind. The house in Modesto, once a symbol of domestic calm, became the center of something far more unsettling. Something wrong had happened there, or around there, or to her, and no one yet knew what shape that wrongness had taken. Scott Peterson, when contacted, appeared calm. Almost too calm, some would later say. He told people his wife was missing, that she had likely gone for a walk and not returned. He presented himself as confused, concerned, but composed. A man trying to hold himself together in the face of sudden chaos. But even in those early hours, before the world had fully turned its attention to Modesto, there were small fractures beginning to appear in the story. Neighbors remembered seeing Laci earlier that morning, but no one recalled seeing her after midday. Her phone activity was limited. Her presence, once so visible in the rhythm of the neighborhood, simply stopped. As if someone had reached in and turned off a light, without anyone noticing the moment it went dark. Police were eventually called. At first, they treated it as a missing persons case, one of many that come and go without resolution. But something about this one quickly escalated. The pregnancy changed everything. An 8-month pregnant woman does not simply vanish without urgency. The clock was no longer measured in days. It was measured in hours. Search teams were organized. Volunteers arrived. Helicopters swept over the city and surrounding farmland. Officers knocked on doors, retraced her steps, asked the same questions over and over again in slightly different ways, hoping something would shift. But the answers remained stubbornly empty. And then there was Scott Peterson. From the outside, he looked like the grieving husband. He spoke to reporters with a controlled sadness, describing Lacey as loving, kind, someone who would never willingly disappear without telling anyone. He stood in front of cameras and asked for help finding her, his voice steady, his posture composed. The kind of man people instinctively wanted to believe. But investigations rarely rely on appearances alone. As detectives began reconstructing the timeline of that day, inconsistencies emerged. Scott's account of where he had been began to shift in small, but noticeable ways. Details about his fishing trip did not align perfectly with what was later confirmed by records and witnesses. The story that had seemed simple at first began to develop edges that didn't fit together cleanly. Then came something even more disturbing. Before Lacey's body had been found, before there was any physical confirmation of her fate, Scott Peterson reportedly told others that she was gone. Not missing. Not lost. Gone. The word carried a weight that investigators could not ignore. It suggested certainty where there should have been uncertainty. It suggested knowledge of something that had not yet been discovered. At the same time, another narrative began forming quietly in the background of the investigation, one that had nothing to do with fishing or missing persons reports. It involved another life Scott Peterson had been living, separate from the image of the devoted husband. A woman named Amber Fry entered the story unexpectedly. She had met Scott without knowing he was married. To her, he presented himself as single, interested, available. Their relationship developed quickly, almost casually at first, like many modern relationships built on incomplete truths. But when she discovered he was married to a pregnant woman who had just disappeared, everything changed. Instead of walking away completely, she made a decision that would alter the trajectory of the investigation. She agreed to cooperate with law enforcement. From that point on, Amber Fry became a silent witness inside the most intimate space of the case. She recorded conversations with Scott, conversations in which grief was strangely absent, replaced by confusion, detachment, and inconsistency. He spoke to her about Lacey in ways that did not match the public image of a desperate husband searching for his missing wife. His tone often felt disconnected, as if he was speaking about a situation happening far away rather than a tragedy unfolding at the center of his own life. These recordings would later become some of the most critical pieces of evidence in the entire case. Not because they contained explicit admissions, but because they revealed something harder to define. A psychological distance. A lack of alignment between emotion and circumstance. A pattern of speech that raised more questions than it answered. Still, at that moment, nothing was proven. Nothing was resolved. The case remained suspended in uncertainty, balanced between hope and dread. As days turned into weeks, the search for Lacey Peterson intensified. The media arrived in Modesto in waves, transforming quiet streets into a landscape of cameras, microphones, and speculation. The community, once calm and insulated, became the center of national attention. Everyone wanted answers. Everyone wanted resolution. But the most important question remained unanswered. Where was Lacey? And beneath that question, another one slowly began to take shape, darker and more uncomfortable. Not just where she was, but what had happened in the hours when she disappeared from the ordinary rhythm of her life. The investigation was no longer just about a missing woman. It was becoming something far more complex. A story with shifting timelines, hidden relationships, and fragments of behavior that did not fit together in any comforting way. And at the center of it all stood a husband who insisted he had nothing to do with her disappearance, even as the space between what he said and what others were discovering continued to grow wider. Christmas passed. The new year arrived. The lights came down from the houses in Modesto, but the case did not fade with them. Instead, it deepened. The absence at the heart of it became more defined, more haunting. Not just the absence of a person, but the absence of certainty itself. And in that uncertainty, the story of Lacey Peterson had already begun its transformation, from a missing persons case into one of the most closely watched criminal investigations in modern American history. No one yet knew how it would end. But the silence she left behind was already speaking louder than anyone expected. The city of Modesto, California, sits quietly in the Central Valley, a place where life tends to move at a predictable pace, anchored by routine and familiarity. Rows of modest homes line the streets, each with its own carefully maintained lawn, each representing a version of stability people come here to build. It is not the kind of place where headlines are made. It is the kind of place where people expect to grow old without interruption. In December, that sense of calm becomes even more pronounced. Winter in Modesto is not harsh. There is no heavy snow to isolate neighborhoods, no bitter winds to force people indoors. Instead, the air cools just enough to justify sweaters, the sky often stretching out in pale blue during the day and soft gray in the early mornings. Christmas decorations appear gradually, almost politely. Strings of lights hung along roof lines. Inflatable figures on front lawns. Wreaths on doors. It is festive, but understated. Familiar. Safe. The Peterson home stood among these quiet streets, blending in perfectly with its surroundings. Nothing about it drew attention. It was clean, organized, a reflection of two people who had built a life that seemed stable from every angle. Inside, the signs of an approaching new chapter were everywhere. A nursery in progress. Baby items waiting to be used. Small, careful preparations that suggested anticipation rather than chaos. From the outside, it was a life many people would recognize as successful. Scott Peterson and Lacey Peterson had met years earlier, their relationship forming in a way that, at least initially, felt ordinary. They married in 1997, building their life together step by step. To friends and family, they appeared well matched. Scott was calm, composed, someone who rarely showed extremes of emotion. Lacey was warm, gentle, the kind of person who made others feel comfortable without trying too hard. Together, they created a version of domestic life that seemed steady. Scott worked as a fertilizer salesman, a job that required travel, long hours, and a certain level of independence. It was not glamorous, but it provided stability. Lacey, on the other hand, worked as a substitute teacher. She moved between classrooms, interacting with students who often remembered her not for strict discipline, but for her patience. She had a way of lowering her voice instead of raising it, a way of redirecting attention rather than demanding it. Their personalities complemented each other in a quiet way. Where Scott was reserved, Lacey filled in the emotional space. Where Lacey was expressive, Scott remained measured. It created a balance that, to outsiders, seemed functional, even ideal. But relationships are rarely as simple as they appear from the outside. Beneath the surface, there were differences in how they envisioned their future. Lacey wanted a family. That desire had grown stronger over time, shaping her expectations of what came next. She talked about it openly, imagined it clearly, saw motherhood as something that would complete the life they had already built. Scott, according to later testimonies, did not share that same urgency. He did not openly resist the idea, but he did not embrace it either. His reactions were often neutral, non-committal. When the topic came up, he would respond, but without enthusiasm. It was not an argument. Not a visible conflict. It was something quieter than that. A misalignment that existed without ever fully surfacing. Eventually, Lacey became pregnant. For her, it was everything she had been waiting for. Friends noticed the change almost immediately. She spoke more about the future, about names, about plans. She imagined the life she would have as a mother with a clarity that made it feel already real. The baby was not just an addition to their life. It was the center of it. They planned to name him Connor. Scott's response to the pregnancy was more difficult to read. He attended appointments. He participated in preparations. But there was an absence that some would later describe as emotional distance. Not hostility. Not rejection. Just a lack of visible connection. At the time, it did not raise alarms. People interpret behavior through the lens of what they expect. A quiet man being quiet does not stand out. It fits the pattern already established. But patterns can hide things as easily as they explain them. As December approached, the Peterson home reflected the season. Decorations appeared. Plans were made. Lacey, 8 months pregnant, moved more slowly now, her body adjusting to the final stages before birth. The physical strain was visible, but so was the anticipation. She was close. Close to meeting the child she had already built an emotional connection with long before his birth. The days leading up to Christmas were filled with small, ordinary moments. Shopping for last-minute gifts. Preparing meals. Talking to family members about holiday plans. These are the details that rarely make headlines, but they are the ones that define real life. They create a rhythm that feels unbreakable, precisely because it is so normal. And that is what made what happened next so difficult to process. There was no obvious disruption. No visible argument. No reported incident that would suggest something was about to go wrong. If anything, everything appeared aligned with expectation. A couple preparing for their first child. A home ready for the holidays. A life moving forward in a predictable direction. But sometimes, the most significant fractures are the ones no one sees forming. In retrospect, investigators would examine every aspect of their relationship, searching for signs that something had been building beneath the surface. They would look at financial records, communication patterns, personal histories. They would reconstruct conversations, analyze behavior, compare statements. And they would find things that, at the time, had gone unnoticed. Small inconsistencies. Subtle contradictions. Moments where reality did not fully align with the image being presented. Scott's life, in particular, began to reveal layers that had not been visible before. His work required travel, and with that travel came opportunities for independence. Time spent away from home. Time unaccounted for in the daily routines that define most relationships. It created space. Space where actions could occur without immediate scrutiny. That space would later become one of the most important elements in understanding what happened. But at this point in the story, none of that had been fully uncovered. At this point, there was only a missing woman, a concerned family, and a husband whose calm demeanor stood in contrast to the growing urgency around him. The neighborhood remained quiet. The same streets, the same houses, the same decorations. But the atmosphere had changed. There was something beneath the surface now, something that disrupted the sense of safety people had once taken for granted. Neighbors began locking their doors more carefully. Conversations shifted in tone. People spoke in lower voices, as if volume alone could disturb something fragile and unresolved. The Peterson home, once just another house on the block, became a focal point. Not just physically, but emotionally. It represented a question no one could answer. How does someone disappear from a place like this? There were no signs of forced entry. No clear evidence of struggle visible to the public. No immediate explanation that fit neatly into the narrative of a safe suburban life. And yet, Laci Peterson was gone. Her absence created a void that extended beyond her immediate circle. It reached into the community, into the media, into the broader public consciousness. Because if something like this could happen here, in a place defined by normalcy, then the boundaries people rely on to feel safe were not as solid as they believed. That realization lingered. It hung in the air as search efforts continued, as investigators worked to piece together a timeline that refused to settle into clarity. Every hour that passed without answers made the situation feel less like a temporary disruption, and more like the beginning of something irreversible. And still, at the center of it all, the image remained. A home decorated for Christmas. A nursery waiting for a child who would never arrive the way it was planned. And a woman whose story, once defined by quiet anticipation, was now being rewritten into something far darker. Something that no one in Modesto had expected, but would soon be forced to confront. Before her name became a headline, before her face appeared on television screens across the country, Laci Peterson was simply someone people remembered for the way she made ordinary moments feel lighter. She had a softness to her presence that didn't demand attention, but quietly held it. Friends would later struggle to describe her in dramatic terms, not because she lacked depth, but because she never needed to be loud to be felt. She was the kind of person who listened fully when someone spoke, who smiled not out of politeness, but because she genuinely found warmth in connection. In a room full of people, she didn't dominate conversations, but somehow, she was always remembered afterward. Laci grew up in California, surrounded by a close-knit family that valued stability and support. Her mother, Sharon Rocha, would later describe her as someone who carried kindness naturally, not as something she tried to perform. It was embedded in the way she spoke, in the way she moved through the world. She wasn't naive, but she chose to believe in the goodness of people longer than most. As a child, she had a quiet imagination. Not the kind that created chaos, but the kind that shaped gentle expectations for the future. She dreamed of having a family, of building a home where life felt safe and predictable. These were not extraordinary dreams, but they were deeply important to her. When she met Scott Peterson, she saw the possibility of that future taking form. Their relationship, at least from her perspective, followed a path that made sense. There was no whirlwind intensity, no dramatic declarations. It was steady. Comfortable. The kind of relationship that grows gradually, reinforcing itself over time. She trusted that what they were building together would last. After they married, Laci leaned into the idea of domestic life with a kind of quiet enthusiasm. She decorated their home carefully, paying attention to small details that others might overlook. The arrangement of furniture, the choice of colors, the way spaces felt when you walked into them. She created an environment that reflected the life she believed they were living. She worked as a substitute teacher, a job that didn't come with prestige or high pay, but one that suited her temperament. In classrooms, she was patient. She didn't raise her voice unnecessarily. She understood that attention could be guided, not forced. Students, who were used to being overlooked, found themselves noticed in her presence. It wasn't something she advertised. It was simply how she interacted with people. Outside of work, her life was filled with routines that felt grounding. She stayed in touch with her family, spoke regularly with her mother, and maintained friendships that were built on consistency rather than intensity. She didn't disappear from people's lives and reappear months later. She was there, present, reliable. When she became pregnant, something shifted, not in who she was, but in how visibly her happiness surfaced. The pregnancy wasn't just an event. It was a transformation. She began to talk more about the future, about the kind of mother she wanted to be. She imagined small details, the way she would hold her child, the routines she would create, the traditions she would build. She spoke about names, eventually settling on Connor, a choice that felt right to her in a way she couldn't fully explain, but didn't need to. Friends noticed the way she touched her stomach absent-mindedly, as if already communicating with the life inside her. There was a protectiveness there, but also a sense of wonder. She wasn't overwhelmed by fear or uncertainty. She embraced the change. Her body changed, her movements slowed, but her sense of purpose seemed to sharpen. Everything she did now was connected to something larger than herself. By December 2002, she was 8 months pregnant. At that stage, every day carried weight. Physically, the strain was visible. Walking required more effort. Standing for long periods became uncomfortable. But emotionally, she seemed grounded. Ready. There was an understanding that the waiting period was almost over. The Peterson home reflected that anticipation. A nursery was being prepared, not yet complete, but clearly in progress. Baby items were arranged with care, some still in packaging, others already placed where they would eventually be used. It wasn't chaotic. It was methodical. Thoughtful. Lacey approached motherhood the same way she approached everything else, with intention. She wasn't trying to create a perfect image. She was trying to create a life that felt real and sustainable. She didn't speak in grand statements about what motherhood would mean. Instead, she focused on the small things. Feeding schedules. Sleep routines. The everyday realities that form the foundation of caring for a child. To those around her, she seemed ready in a way that didn't require reassurance. But there were also moments, subtle and easily overlooked, where her expectations met quiet resistance. Scott Peterson's emotional distance during the pregnancy did not go entirely unnoticed. Lacey, however, did not interpret it as rejection. She explained it to herself in ways that preserved the image of their relationship. He was busy. He was stressed. He expressed things differently. These were the kinds of justifications people make when they believe in the foundation they've built. There is a kind of optimism in that. A willingness to fill in the gaps with trust rather than doubt. Lacey chose trust. In the days leading up to Christmas, she moved through her routines with the same quiet focus she always had. She prepared for the holiday, spoke with family, made plans that extended beyond the immediate moment. There was no indication that she felt unsafe, no suggestion that she was anticipating anything other than the continuation of the life she had been building. On the morning of December 24th, she woke up in that same house, surrounded by the same objects she had carefully arranged, carrying the same expectations for the future. She dressed comfortably, aware of the physical limitations of late pregnancy. She moved through the house in a familiar pattern, small tasks blending into one another. At some point, she decided to take the dog for a walk. It was a simple decision. One she had likely made countless times before. Outside, the air was cool but not harsh. The neighborhood was quiet in the way it often is on Christmas Eve morning. People were inside, preparing for the day ahead. The streets were not empty, but they were calm. She walked slowly, adjusting her pace to her body. The dog moved ahead, then circled back, the leash creating a gentle rhythm between them. Neighbors who saw her that morning would later recall nothing unusual. She smiled. She spoke briefly. She existed exactly as she always had. There was no visible fear. No urgency. No indication that this moment would be the last time anyone would see her alive. And that is what makes her story so difficult to reconcile. Because when someone disappears after showing signs of distress, the mind can build a narrative around it. It can find patterns, connect behavior to outcome. But when someone disappears from a moment of complete normalcy, the absence feels sharper. More abrupt. Harder to process. Lacey Peterson did not leave behind a trail of warning signs. She left behind a life that was mid-sentence. A home that was still being arranged. A future that had already been imagined in detail. And a child who would never experience the world she had been preparing for him. In the days that followed her disappearance, as search efforts intensified and questions multiplied, those who knew her returned again and again to the same realization. This did not make sense. Not because they didn't understand that bad things happen, but because nothing in Lacey's life suggested this kind of ending. She was not someone who lived on the edges of danger. She was not someone entangled in risky situations or volatile relationships, at least not in any way that was visible. She was, by all accounts, someone who had done everything right. And yet, she was gone. Her story, once defined by quiet hope and steady progression, had been interrupted in a way that felt almost unnatural in its suddenness. It forced those who loved her to confront a reality they were not prepared for. That sometimes, the most ordinary lives can become the center of the most extraordinary tragedies. And sometimes, the person you think you know best is not the person you truly know at all. December 24, 2002, began like any other winter morning in Modesto, but as the hours unfolded, the ordinary rhythm of the day would fracture in ways no one present could have anticipated. Inside the Peterson home, the air carried the quiet stillness of early morning. The kind of stillness that exists before the world fully wakes up. No raised voices. No sudden movements. Just the soft, almost imperceptible sounds of a house settling into the day. Lacey Peterson moved through that space slowly, her body adjusting to the weight of 8 months of pregnancy. Every action required a little more effort now, a little more patience. But she had adapted to it. She knew how to pace herself, how to turn even the smallest tasks into something manageable. The kitchen counter held traces of preparation. Items set out, not in disarray, but mid-process. A bowl. Ingredients. The suggestion of something that had been started, but not yet finished. These were the kinds of details that would later be examined repeatedly, each object taking on a weight far greater than its original purpose. At some point that morning, she decided to take the dog for a walk. It was not a remarkable decision. It did not carry the kind of significance people would later assign to it. It was routine. Familiar. A small act of normalcy before the day's larger plans unfolded. Outside, the neighborhood remained calm. The sky was pale, the air cool enough to sting lightly against the skin, but not enough to drive people indoors. Christmas Eve has a way of slowing things down, creating a pause before celebration. Fewer cars on the road. Fewer people outside. A quiet anticipation. Lacey stepped into that stillness, leash in hand, the dog eager in a way that only animals can be, unaware of the invisible boundaries that define human lives. She walked at a measured pace, adjusting naturally to her condition. Her steps were steady, deliberate. The dog moved slightly ahead, then back again, the leash forming a gentle line between them. Neighbors would later recall seeing her A wave. A brief exchange. Nothing that lingered long enough to become a memory at the time. But later, those fleeting interactions would be replayed again and again, each person searching their recollection for something they might have missed. A gesture. A tone. Anything that could explain what happened next. But there was nothing. No raised voice. No sign of distress. No sudden interruption. Just a woman walking her dog on a quiet street. At some point, she returned home. Or at least, that is what the evidence suggests. Because the dog was later found wandering alone, still wearing its leash. The leash, looped but not secured, suggested a transition. A moment where control was lost or relinquished. The dog had not escaped on its own. Something had changed. Inside the house, the signs of Lacey's presence remained. Her shoes. Her personal belongings. Objects that people do not leave behind when they intend to go somewhere. The absence of movement was almost louder than any sign of struggle. It created a question that lingered over everything. If she had left, why had she left like this? If she had not left, then what had happened inside that space? Scott Peterson would later say that he had already left the house by the time anything could have occurred. According to his account, he departed that morning for a fishing trip. He drove to the Barclay Marina, a considerable distance away, placing himself physically far from Modesto during the critical hours. It was a detail that, at first, seemed to provide a clear boundary. A separation between him and whatever had happened. But timelines are fragile things. They rely on consistency. On alignment between what is said and what can be verified. And as investigators would later discover, Scott's timeline did not remain fixed. Small details shifted. The time he left. The sequence of events. The specifics of his trip. Individually, these inconsistencies might not have meant much. Memory is imperfect. People forget details. They reconstruct events in ways that make sense to them. But collectively, they began to form a pattern. One that suggested something was not being fully revealed. Back in Modesto, the day continued. Time moved forward, indifferent to the absence that had already taken hold. At some point, concern began to surface. Phone calls went unanswered. Expected interactions did not occur. The kind of small disruptions that, at first, can be explained away. Maybe she was resting. Maybe she had stepped out. Maybe she simply hadn't heard the phone. But as hours passed, those explanations began to lose their weight. The dog, found wandering alone, became one of the first concrete signs that something was wrong. A neighbor discovered it and returned it to the Peterson home. The act itself was simple, almost routine. But in hindsight, it marked a turning point. A moment where normal explanations began to give way to something more serious. Inside the house, the silence felt different now. Not peaceful. Not ordinary. Incomplete. When Scott returned later that day, he would say he noticed immediately that something was off. The house was not as it should have been. Lacey was not there. The absence was immediate, undeniable. He called her name. Waited. Moved through the rooms, each one offering the same answer. Nothing. There is a specific kind of realization that occurs when absence becomes undeniable. It doesn't happen all at once. It builds. Each unanswered call. Each empty room. Each moment where expectation meets silence. Scott contacted Lacey's family. His voice, according to accounts, carried concern. Urgency. The beginning of something that would soon escalate beyond anything they had imagined. Her mother, upon hearing that Lacey was missing, reacted with immediate alarm. This was not consistent with her daughter's behavior. Lacey did not disappear without telling someone. She did not leave without contact. The idea that she would simply vanish did not align with anything they knew about her. The situation shifted quickly from confusion to fear. Law enforcement was contacted. Officers arrived at the Peterson home, stepping into a space that still held the imprint of a life interrupted. They observed. They documented. They began the process that would eventually expand far beyond that single house. At first, it was treated as a missing persons case. But even in those early hours, there was an undercurrent of something more. Because while the house showed no obvious signs of forced entry, no clear evidence of struggle visible to the naked eye, the absence itself was too complete. Too clean. People do not simply disappear in the middle of their lives, leaving everything behind, without some form of disruption. And yet, the disruption here was invisible. That invisibility made it more unsettling. As night fell over Modesto, the atmosphere shifted. Christmas Eve, once filled with anticipation and warmth, became something else entirely. Lights still glowed from windows. Decorations still lined the streets. But beneath that surface, there was tension now. A question that had no answer. Where was Lacey Peterson? And more importantly, what had happened between the moment she was last seen walking her dog and the moment her absence was discovered? Those hours, seemingly ordinary at first, had become the most critical period in the entire case. A gap in time. A space where something irreversible had occurred. Something no one had witnessed. Something that had already begun to reshape the lives of everyone connected to her. The day had started in silence. It would end in uncertainty. And somewhere within that silence, the truth was already there, waiting to be uncovered. By the time the first officers stepped into the Peterson home, the atmosphere had already shifted from confusion to something heavier, something harder to define. It was no longer just a missing person situation in the casual sense. There was a density to the air, a quiet tension that lingered in every room, as if the house itself was holding on to something it could not express. The front door opened without resistance. Inside, nothing appeared overturned. No furniture displaced, no shattered glass, no obvious signs of violence. At first glance, it looked like any other home on a winter afternoon. Clean. Organized. Lived in. But investigators are trained to look beyond the obvious. They don't just see what's present. They notice what's missing. Lacey Peterson was not there, and yet her presence lingered everywhere. Her shoes remained inside, positioned as if she had simply stepped out of them and intended to return shortly. Her purse was still in the house, a detail that immediately stood out. People do not leave without their purse, especially not someone 8 months pregnant. It was more than an accessory. It contained identity, money, essentials. Leaving it behind suggested she had not planned to go anywhere. Keys were accounted for. Personal belongings untouched. There was no sign of packing, no indication that she had prepared to leave, even temporarily. In the kitchen, something else caught attention. Items left out mid-task. Not chaotic, not scattered, but paused. A bowl, ingredients, small signs that something had been started but not finished. It created a subtle, but powerful impression. Whatever interrupted her day had done so abruptly. Investigators moved carefully, documenting everything. Every object. Every surface. Every detail that might later carry significance. The absence of visible struggle complicated things. There were no immediate indicators of forced entry. No clear evidence that someone had broken in. No obvious signs that a violent confrontation had taken place. And yet, the situation did not align with a voluntary disappearance. Outside, the detail that had already begun to draw attention was the dog. The family's dog had been found wandering the neighborhood, leash still attached. A neighbor had discovered it and returned it to the yard, assuming it had simply slipped away. At the time, it seemed like a minor detail. Dogs get loose. Leashes fall. It happens. But in the context of a missing pregnant woman, it became something else entirely. The leash was not torn. Not broken. It had been removed in a way that suggested human involvement. The loop was intact, not snapped. This was not a dog that had fought its way free. It was a dog that had been released. That single detail began to shift the direction of the investigation. Because it introduced a question that could not be easily answered. Why would Lacey remove the leash and allow the dog to wander? It didn't align with her behavior. She was known to be responsible, attentive. Letting the dog roam freely without supervision did not fit the pattern of her actions. Which meant one of two things. Either she had been interrupted while walking the dog, or someone else had been there. Inside the house, investigators continued their assessment. Scott Peterson moved through the same space, recounting his version of events. He explained that he had left that morning for a fishing trip, that he had been gone for several hours, and that when he returned, Lacey was missing. His tone was measured. Controlled. He did not appear panicked in the way some might expect. Instead, he maintained a steady composure, answering questions, providing information, cooperating in a way that, on the surface, aligned with someone trying to help. But investigators are trained to observe more than just words. They watch body language, eye movement, the timing of responses. And while nothing he said immediately contradicted itself in a way that could be proven false on the spot, there was something about the delivery that didn't fully settle. It wasn't overt. It wasn't dramatic. It was subtle. A slight delay before answering certain questions. A calmness that felt, to some, out of place given the circumstances. Not enough to accuse. Not enough to act on. But enough to note. Outside the house, the neighborhood began to fill with quiet activity. Neighbors gathered in small groups, speaking in low voices, trying to piece together what little they knew. The story spread quickly. A pregnant woman missing. A dog found alone. A husband who had been out of town for the day. It didn't take long for concern to ripple outward. Law enforcement expanded their efforts. Search teams were organized, initially focusing on the immediate area. Streets were canvassed. Yards were checked. Nearby parks and open spaces were examined. Officers retraced the route Lacey would have taken during her walk, looking for anything that might have been dropped, disturbed, or left behind. But the ground revealed nothing. No signs of struggle. No discarded items. No physical evidence that pointed clearly in any direction. It was as if she had vanished between one step and the next. As the hours passed, the investigation began to shift from a localized search to something broader. Phone records were requested. Timelines were constructed. Every known interaction from that morning was examined. Who had seen her? When they had seen her. What she had been doing. These fragments of information were assembled into a sequence, but the sequence itself contained gaps. Critical gaps. Periods of time where no one could account for her movements with certainty. And it was within those gaps that the focus began to narrow. Because while many elements of the case remained unclear, one thing was undeniable. The last place Lacey Peterson was known to be connected to was her home. That fact alone made it central. Not necessarily a crime scene in the traditional sense, but a point of origin. A place where something had either happened or begun. Investigators returned to it repeatedly, each time looking for something they might have missed. Something small. Something easily overlooked. A fiber. A mark. A trace. But the house remained quiet. Unyielding. It offered no immediate answers. As night deepened, the situation escalated further. Media began to arrive, their presence transforming the street into something unfamiliar. Cameras set up along sidewalks. Reporters speaking into microphones, summarizing what little was known, filling the rest with speculation. The story had begun to spread beyond Modesto. A pregnant woman missing on Christmas Eve. It was the kind of case that captured attention instantly. Emotionally. Viscerally. Because it violated expectations in a way that felt deeply unsettling. Inside the Peterson home, the lights remained on. Rooms that had once been filled with routine now held something else. Absence. Not just physical absence, but emotional. The kind that settles into a space and changes it permanently. Investigators continued their work, but the lack of immediate evidence forced them into a different approach. They would need to build the case slowly. Piece by piece. Detail by detail. And at the center of that process would be the reconstruction of what had happened during those missing hours. The hours between the last confirmed sighting of Lacey and the moment her absence was discovered. Somewhere in that window, something had occurred. Something deliberate. Something final. And while the house itself remained silent, the investigation was only just beginning to learn how to listen. In the days that followed, the investigation began to expand outward, stretching beyond the walls of the Peterson home and into the wider landscape of Modesto. What had started as a search for a missing pregnant woman was evolving into something far more complex, something layered with uncertainty, contradictions, and an increasing number of possibilities that refused to settle into a single, clear narrative. Detectives moved quickly, not because they had answers, but because they didn't. The absence of evidence in the early hours of a case like this is not reassuring. It is dangerous. It allows time to pass without direction, and in that time, memories fade, details blur, and opportunities to capture the truth begin to slip away. So they began where all investigations begin. With people. Neighbors were interviewed first. One by one, they were asked to reconstruct their morning, to recall anything unusual, anything that might have seemed insignificant at the time, but could now hold meaning. Conversations repeated themselves in different houses, on different streets, with different tones. Some remembered seeing Lacey Peterson walking her dog. Others believed they had seen her, but could not be certain of the time. A few reported nothing at all. The problem was not the lack of information. It was the lack of consistency. Human memory is fragile, especially when it is forced to revisit ordinary moments and assign them new importance. What was once background noise becomes something people try to sharpen, to define, to make useful. But in doing so, details shift. Timelines blur. Certainty dissolves. Detectives began mapping these statements, placing them against the known sequence of events. Some pieces aligned. Others did not. And in that misalignment, the first real sense of confusion took hold. At the same time, attention turned toward potential external threats. Could someone have approached Lacey during her walk? The neighborhood, while generally quiet, was not isolated. There were streets that led in and out, spaces where someone could move without drawing attention. Investigators considered the possibility of a random abduction, a crime of opportunity. They examined known offenders in the area. Reviewed recent reports of suspicious activity. Looked into individuals with histories of violence or intrusion. Every possibility was considered, no matter how unlikely it seemed. One theory suggested that Lacey may have encountered someone while walking the dog. That she had been approached, taken quickly, removed from the scene before anyone could notice. It was a scenario that fit the absence of struggle inside the home. It explained why the dog had been found alone. But it lacked something critical. Evidence. There were no signs of a struggle outside. No witnesses who reported hearing anything unusual. No physical traces that indicated a forced abduction had taken place on the street. It was possible, but it was not supported. Another theory emerged. Could she have left voluntarily? It was quickly dismissed by those who knew her. Lacey did not disappear without telling someone. She did not leave her purse, her belongings, her entire life behind. She was 8 months pregnant. Everything about her situation pointed toward stability, not escape. Still, investigators could not rely solely on character assessments. They had to consider every angle, even those that seemed inconsistent with her personality. They reviewed her phone records, her recent communications, her movements in the days leading up to her disappearance. Nothing indicated preparation for leaving. No hidden plans. No unexplained withdrawals. No contact with unknown individuals that would suggest an arranged meeting. The more they looked, the clearer it became that Lacey Peterson had not chosen to disappear. Which brought the investigation back to a more uncomfortable question. If she had not left willingly, then someone had acted against her. And that someone, statistically, was most likely to be someone she knew. The focus began to narrow. Not publicly. Not yet. But internally, investigators started to look more closely at the people closest to her. At the center of that circle was Scott Peterson. He had already provided his statement. He had explained his whereabouts. He had positioned himself outside the timeline of the disappearance. But proximity is not just physical. It is relational. And in cases like this, the person closest to the victim is often the first place investigators look, not because of assumption, but because of probability. Scott's account of the day was revisited. Again and again. Each time, detectives listened for consistency. For alignment. For anything that might shift under pressure. At first, the discrepancies were small. The exact time he left the house. The order in which he completed certain tasks. Details that, on their own, could be explained by memory. But when placed side by side, they created friction. A timeline that did not settle cleanly. Then came the fishing trip. Scott had said he went to the Barkley Marina, a significant distance from Modesto. It was not a casual outing. It required planning, time, intention. He had chosen that location specifically. Investigators began verifying that claim. They checked receipts, travel times, witness accounts, everything that could confirm or challenge his presence there. Yes, he had been at the marina. But the timeline surrounding that trip raised questions. The duration. The purpose. The decision to go fishing alone on Christmas Eve. It was not impossible. But it was unusual. And in an investigation built on fragments, unusual details carry weight. At the same time, another layer of Scott's life began to surface. One that had not been immediately visible. A relationship. Not with his wife. But with another woman. Amber Fry. When detectives first learned of Amber, it introduced a new dimension to the case. One that shifted the narrative from uncertainty to something more defined. Scott had been involved with her in the weeks leading up to Lacey's disappearance. He had presented himself as single, available, a man without the life he actually had. When Amber discovered the truth, that he was married and that his wife was missing, she did not withdraw quietly. She contacted authorities. And from that moment on, she became one of the most important figures in the investigation. Under the guidance of law enforcement, she agreed to record her conversations with Scott. Phone calls that would later reveal not just what he said, but how he said it. His tone. His emotional responses. Or lack of them. In those recordings, something began to emerge. A disconnect. While the public saw a husband searching for his missing wife, the private conversations painted a different picture. Scott spoke to Amber with a calmness that felt out of place. He did not express the urgency or distress that would be expected. At times, he even referenced Lacey in a way that suggested finality. As if he already knew she would not be found alive. Those conversations did not provide direct evidence of a crime. But they revealed something else. State of mind. And in a case where physical evidence was limited, psychological evidence became increasingly important. Still, the investigation was far from complete. Each new discovery opened additional questions. If Scott had something to hide, what was it? If he was not telling the truth, where did the truth diverge from his account? And if someone else had been involved, where were they? The case began to stretch in multiple directions at once. Possible suspects. Unverified sightings. Alternative theories. Each one explored. Each one tested. Many led nowhere. Dead ends that consume time and energy, only to collapse under scrutiny. But even dead ends serve a purpose. They eliminate possibilities. They narrow the field. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the investigation began to circle back to the same point. The same person. The same set of inconsistencies. The same unresolved questions. As the days turned into weeks, the pressure increased. Media coverage intensified. Public interest grew. The story had become national, and with that attention came expectation. People wanted answers. They wanted clarity. They wanted resolution. But investigations do not move according to public demand. They move according to evidence. And at this stage, the evidence was still forming. Still incomplete. Still just out of reach. Somewhere within the contradictions, the half-truths, and the silence, the truth existed. But it had not yet revealed itself. Not fully. Not clearly. And until it did, the case remained suspended between possibilities, each one waiting to either collapse or become something far more definitive. By early January, the investigation had reached a point where uncertainty was no longer just frustrating, it was dangerous. Weeks had passed since Lacey Peterson vanished, and while the search efforts had expanded, the answers remained just out of reach, like something visible beneath the surface of water but impossible to grasp. The case had grown beyond Modesto. Media trucks lined the streets. Satellite dishes pointed skyward. Reporters spoke in measured tones, repeating the same facts, the same questions, the same haunting absence. Lacey's face had become recognizable across the country. Her story was no longer just local. It had become national. And with that attention came pressure. Pressure on law enforcement to produce answers. Pressure on the family to hold on to hope. And pressure on Scott Peterson, whether he showed it or not. Behind the scenes, investigators were no longer just collecting information. They were testing it. Challenging it. Looking for the moment where everything would either collapse or align. That moment, the breakthrough, rarely arrives suddenly. It builds. Quietly. Piece by piece. And in this case, it began with patterns. The recorded conversations between Scott and Amber Fry were analyzed repeatedly. Not just for content, but for tone, pacing, emotional consistency. Investigators listened to them the way a musician listens to a composition, searching for notes that didn't belong. What they found was not a confession. It was something more subtle. A man who spoke about his missing wife without urgency. A man who maintained a relationship with another woman while publicly asking for help to find his pregnant spouse. A man whose words, when placed side by side with his public statements, did not match. In one call, he spoke to Amber from what he claimed was Paris, describing the city as if he were there, surrounded by celebration, by movement, by life. But in reality, he was standing near a vigil for Lacey, surrounded by people praying for her safe return. The contrast was jarring. It wasn't just a lie. It was a performance. And that performance began to crack under scrutiny. At the same time, forensic analysis of Scott's movements began to solidify timelines that had previously been uncertain. His trip to the Barclay Marina, once just a detail in his account, became a focal point. Investigators revisited it with precision. They reconstructed the drive. Calculated the time it would take. Examined the weather conditions, the water currents, the visibility. They looked at what he brought with him. Fishing gear. A boat. Equipment that, on its own, was not suspicious. But when placed within the context of a missing person case, it became something else. Something potentially significant. The marina itself was expansive, open, surrounded by water that moved unpredictably. It was not a place where evidence would easily remain intact. If something had been placed there, it would not necessarily stay there. And that realization shifted the direction of the investigation. Search efforts expanded toward the San Francisco Bay. Boats were deployed. Divers entered the water. Sonar equipment scanned beneath the surface. The process was slow, methodical, and often inconclusive. Water does not give up its secrets easily. It distorts, conceals, erases. But the decision to focus there was not random. It was based on alignment. Scott's location. The timing. The possibility that what had happened in Modesto did not end in Modesto. As this shift occurred, another layer of the case began to solidify. Motive. Up until this point, the investigation had been driven largely by inconsistencies and behavior. But now, a clearer picture of Scott's life began to emerge, one that suggested not just deception, but intention. His relationship with Amber Fry was no longer just an affair. It was a contradiction. He had told her he was single. He had built a version of himself that did not include his wife or his unborn child. And more importantly, he had told her, before Lacey was reported missing, that he had lost his wife. That detail struck investigators with particular force. Because it suggested foreknowledge. Not of a disappearance, but of an ending. When confronted with this timeline, the narrative began to shift. This was no longer just about a missing woman. It was about a man who appeared to be preparing for a life without her. Financial records were examined. Insurance policies. Recent purchases. Patterns that might indicate planning rather than reaction. Each piece on its own was not definitive. But together, they began to form a structure. A framework that pointed in a specific direction. Still, the case lacked one critical element. A body. Without it, everything remained circumstantial. Strong. Compelling. But not absolute. Investigators knew this. They understood that without physical confirmation, the case would always carry doubt. Always leave room for alternative explanations. And yet, they continued building it. Because sometimes, the truth exists even before it is fully proven. Then, in April 2003, nearly 4 months after Lacey disappeared, something changed. Along the shoreline of the San Francisco Bay, a passerby noticed something unusual. At first, it did not register clearly. Just an object. Out of place. But as authorities were called and the scene was secured, the reality began to take shape. It was the body of a newborn. Decomposed. Damaged by time and water. But unmistakably human. The discovery sent a shock through the investigation. Because it aligned with what had been feared, but not yet confirmed. Days later, in the same general area, another body was found. This time, it was Lacey. The condition of her remains reflected months in the water. Identification was not immediate, but it was confirmed through forensic analysis. The discovery changed everything. The case was no longer about a missing person. It was about a homicide. And suddenly, the timeline that had once been abstract became grounded in reality. Lacey had not disappeared. She had been killed. The location of the bodies, near where Scott had gone fishing, intensified the focus on him to a level that could no longer be ignored. It was no longer just about inconsistencies. It was about convergence. His story. His movements. The evidence. All pointing toward the same place. The same conclusion. Within days, law enforcement acted. On April 18, 2003, Scott Peterson was located near the Mexican border. His appearance had changed. His hair dyed. His vehicle filled with items that suggested preparation for departure, cash, supplies, belongings that did not align with someone living a normal routine. He was arrested. Not in a dramatic chase. Not in a violent confrontation. But in a moment that felt almost quiet, given the magnitude of what it represented. The man who had stood in front of cameras, asking for help finding his wife, was now in custody for her murder. The breakthrough had come. Not as a single revelation, but as a culmination. A series of details that, when finally aligned, left little room for doubt. But even then, the story was not over. Because proving something in an investigation is one thing. Proving it in a courtroom is another entirely. And the battle for truth was about to move into a new phase. One where every detail would be challenged. Every assumption questioned. And every piece of evidence tested under the harshest possible light. The silence that had once surrounded Lacey's disappearance had been broken. But what replaced it was not closure. It was confrontation. The courtroom was colder than expected. Not in temperature, but in atmosphere. The kind of cold that settles into a space where every word carries weight, where every movement is observed, measured, interpreted. By the time the trial of Scott Peterson began, the story of Lacey Peterson had already lived in the public consciousness for nearly 2 years. But inside that room, the noise of the outside world was stripped away. Here, there would be no speculation. Only evidence. Only arguments. Only the slow, deliberate process of deciding what was true. Scott sat at the defense table, dressed in a suit that seemed carefully chosen to present calm, control, normalcy. His posture was straight, his expression neutral. To anyone watching without context, he could have been mistaken for a man involved in a routine legal proceeding. But nothing about this was routine. Across the room, the prosecution prepared to tell a story. Not just of what happened, but of why it happened. Because in the absence of a clear cause of death, in the absence of direct physical evidence tying Scott to the act itself, motive became central. The case would not hinge on a single piece of undeniable proof. It would be built from accumulation, behavior, decisions, patterns. The prosecution's narrative was methodical. They began with the life that had been presented to the world. A husband, a wife, a child on the way. A future that, on the surface, appeared stable. And then, slowly, they began to peel that image apart. They introduced the relationship with Amber Fry, not as a side detail, but as a central fracture in Scott's life. Amber took the stand, her presence quiet but steady. She spoke without dramatics, recounting how she had met Scott, how he had presented himself as single, how she had only learned the truth after Lacey disappeared. Her voice did not rise. She did not accuse. She simply described. And in that description, the contrast became unavoidable. A man publicly searching for his missing wife. The same man privately building a new relationship, one that required the complete absence of the life he claimed to be desperate to restore. Then came the recordings. The jury listened. Not to what Scott claimed in front of cameras, but to what he said when he believed no one else was listening. His tone was calm, detached at times, inconsistent with the urgency of a husband whose pregnant wife had vanished. In one call, he spoke as if he were in Paris, describing a place he was not actually in, maintaining a lie while standing near a vigil for the woman he was supposed to be mourning. The prosecution did not need to explain the significance. They let the contrast speak for itself. Next, they turned to the timeline. Every movement Scott made on December 24 was examined in detail. His trip to the Barclay Marina, once presented as a simple fishing outing, was reconstructed minute by minute. The distance from Modesto. The time required to travel. The conditions of the water. Experts were brought in to discuss the behavior of bodies in water, how currents move, how decomposition affects buoyancy, how objects submerged in the bay might later resurface along the shoreline. It was not a single definitive answer. But it was a framework. One that aligned with where Lacey and her unborn son were eventually found. The defense, in turn, approached the case from a different angle. They did not need to prove Scott's innocence. They needed to create doubt. And doubt, in a case built largely on circumstantial evidence, was not difficult to introduce. They emphasized what was missing. No eyewitness. No murder weapon. No definitive cause of death. They reminded the jury that suspicion, no matter how strong, is not proof. They suggested alternative scenarios. The possibility of a random abduction. The idea that someone else could have taken Lacey while she was walking her dog. They pointed to reports of suspicious individuals in the area, to burglaries that had occurred nearby, to timelines that could be interpreted in different ways. Their argument was not that these alternatives were proven. Only that they were possible. And if they were possible, then certainty could not exist. The courtroom became a space of tension between these two narratives. One built on accumulation. The other built on absence. Witnesses came and went. Experts testified. Evidence was presented, challenged, reinterpreted. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into months. The rhythm of the trial was deliberate, almost exhausting in its repetition. Each detail revisited, each statement examined from multiple angles. Outside the courtroom, the world watched. Media coverage remained intense, but inside, the process remained insulated. The jury was isolated, instructed to consider only what was presented within those walls. And still, the central question remained. What happened to Lacey Peterson? Not in theory. Not in speculation. But in fact, as the trial moved toward its conclusion, both sides sharpened their arguments. The prosecution returned to motive. They argued that Scott did not want the life he had built. That the impending arrival of a child represented not joy, but constraint. That his relationship with Amber Fry was not an isolated mistake, but part of a larger pattern of deception. They framed the case as one of intention. A decision made before the act. A plan carried out under the cover of normalcy. The defense responded by returning to uncertainty. They reminded the jury that no one had seen Scott commit a crime. That no physical evidence placed him at the scene of a murder. That the timeline, while suspicious, was not definitive. They urged the jury to separate emotion from fact. To resist the narrative that felt complete, but lacked direct proof. Closing arguments brought everything together. The prosecution spoke with clarity, guiding the jury through the sequence of events, reinforcing the connections between behavior, motive, and outcome. They did not rely on a single moment of revelation. Instead, they built a cumulative weight. The defense countered with restraint, focusing on the gaps, the unanswered questions, the areas where certainty could not be claimed. And then, the case was handed over. The jury retreated to deliberate. Inside that room, away from cameras and commentary, 12 individuals faced the task of deciding what could be known and what could not. They reviewed the evidence. Revisited testimony. Discussed, debated, questioned. Time stretched. The weight of the decision settled over them. Because this was not just about determining guilt. It was about defining truth in a case where truth was not presented in a single, clear form. Finally, they returned. The courtroom filled again. Silence settled into every corner. Scott Peterson stood. The verdict was read. Guilty. First-degree murder for the death of Lacey. Second-degree murder for the death of their unborn son. The words landed with a finality that no argument could undo. In that moment, the narrative that had been constructed over months solidified into judgment. But the process was not yet complete. In 2005, the penalty phase concluded with a sentence of death. Scott Peterson would be sent to San Quentin State Prison, where he would remain for years as appeals moved through the system. Later, in 2020, that death sentence would be overturned, reduced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The legal outcome, while definitive in its structure, did not erase the questions that had surrounded the case from the beginning. Because even with a verdict, even with a sentence, the nature of the evidence left room for interpretation. Some believed the case was clear. That the accumulation of behavior, motive, and circumstance pointed unmistakably to guilt. Others saw it differently. They saw a case built on inference. On connections that, while compelling, were not absolute. And in that divide, the story of Lacey Peterson did not end. It lingered. Not just as a case that had been decided, but as one that continued to be examined, debated, and remembered. A story where the truth, once sought in silence, had been spoken aloud in a courtroom. But still, for some, remained just out of reach. In the weeks after the verdict, the world did not move on as quickly as it usually does. Cases like this often fade once a decision is reached, once the courtroom doors close and the legal system delivers its conclusion. But the story of Lacey Peterson did not settle into silence. It lingered, suspended somewhere between resolution and unease, as if the finality of the verdict had not fully answered the questions it was meant to resolve. Outside the courthouse, the reactions were immediate and divided. Some people stood in quiet relief, as though a weight they had been carrying for nearly 2 years had finally been lifted. To them, the conviction of Scott Peterson confirmed what they had come to believe long before the trial even began. The evidence, though circumstantial, had formed a pattern too consistent to ignore. His behavior, his lies, his detachment, these were not random flaws. They were signals. Indicators of something deliberate. For others, the reaction was more complicated. They did not celebrate. They did not feel relief. Instead, they felt uncertainty harden into something permanent. Not because they believed Scott was innocent, but because they were not entirely convinced of his guilt beyond doubt. The absence of direct evidence continued to echo in their minds. No witness. No clear cause of death. No single moment that undeniably proved what had happened. And in that absence, doubt found space to exist. Inside the Peterson family, grief took on different shapes. For Lacey's mother, the verdict was not closure. It was confirmation of loss. The kind of loss that does not resolve itself through justice, no matter how decisive the outcome appears. She had spent months holding on to the possibility, however small, that her daughter might still be found alive. That possibility had long since faded, but hope does not disappear cleanly. It leaves behind fragments. Now, those fragments had nowhere left to go. The courtroom had spoken. The system had delivered its answer. But the emotional reality remained unchanged. Lacey was gone. Her son, Connor, was gone. And no verdict could restore what had been taken. In the months that followed, the case continued to ripple outward. Media coverage did not stop. Documentaries, interviews, analyses, each one revisiting the same details, the same questions, the same haunting gaps. The story became something larger than itself, a reference point in discussions about justice, about evidence, about how truth is constructed in the absence of certainty. People debated the case in living rooms, online forums, classrooms. Some focused on Scott's behavior, arguing that his actions before and after Lacey's disappearance revealed a psychological pattern that could not be ignored. The lies to Amber Fry. The calmness during media appearances. The inconsistencies in his timeline. To them, these were not coincidences. They were pieces of a larger truth. Others focused on what was missing. They questioned whether behavior alone could justify a conviction for murder. They pointed to alternative theories, however unlikely, and argued that the absence of definitive physical evidence left too much room for doubt. They asked whether the narrative presented in court had been shaped as much by perception as by proof. The case became a mirror, reflecting not just what had happened, but how people interpret what happens. How they weigh evidence. How they define certainty. How they decide what is enough. Meanwhile, Scott Peterson's life moved into a different kind of confinement. San Quentin State Prison became his new reality. The routines there were rigid, controlled, stripped of individuality. Days measured not by personal choice, but by institutional structure. Time became something to endure rather than something to use. In 2005, he was sentenced to death. The decision added another layer to the case, one that extended beyond guilt into the realm of punishment. The death penalty, always controversial, reignited debates that had existed long before this trial. Some saw it as appropriate, a proportional response to the loss of 2 lives. Others saw it as excessive, especially in a case built without direct evidence. Years passed. Appeals were filed. Arguments revisited. The legal process continued, slower now, but still active. Then, in 2020, the death sentence was overturned. Not because of new evidence proving innocence, but because of issues related to jury selection. The conviction itself remained intact, but the punishment was reduced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. For some, this change mattered deeply. For others, it did not change the core of the case. Scott Peterson would never be free again. But even that finality did not resolve the deeper tension that had always existed within the story. Because this case was never just about what happened. It was about how it was understood. In Modesto, life gradually returned to its familiar rhythm. The streets quieted. The media left. New stories replaced old ones. But the memory of what had happened did not disappear completely. It lingered in subtle ways, in conversations that resurfaced when similar cases appeared in the news, in the way people looked at their surroundings with just a little more awareness than before. The Peterson home itself became something different. No longer just a place where people lived, but a location tied to an event that had altered the perception of safety in that community. For those who remembered, it was impossible to see it as just another house. It held a story. One that could not be separated from its walls. And beyond Modesto, the case continued to exist in a broader cultural space. It became part of the ongoing conversation about true crime, about how society engages with stories of violence, about the line between seeking justice and seeking narrative closure. Because at its core, the story of Laci Peterson resists simplicity. It does not offer a single, clean answer that satisfies every question. It leaves behind tension. Between evidence and interpretation. Between belief and doubt. Between what can be proven and what can only be inferred. And perhaps that is why it continues to endure. Not just because of what happened, but because of what it represents. A reminder that even in a system designed to deliver certainty, there are cases where certainty feels incomplete. Where the truth, though officially declared, still carries shadows. Where the silence that once surrounded a disappearance is replaced not by clarity, but by a different kind of quiet. One that lingers long after the story is told. Time has a way of softening the edges of even the most brutal stories, but some cases resist that erosion. The story of Laci Peterson did not fade into the background. It settled into something quieter, but no less present, a case that continued to breathe beneath the surface of public memory, resurfacing again and again, each time carrying the same unresolved weight. Years passed. Seasons changed in Modesto, the same streets cycling through summer heat and winter calm, the same houses standing in place as if nothing had ever happened. New families moved in. Old neighbors moved away. The visible signs of the past disappeared, replaced by the ongoing rhythm of ordinary life. But memory does not disappear as easily as physical evidence. For those who followed the case, who had watched it unfold day by day, detail by detail, the questions remained. Not always at the front of their minds, but never entirely gone. They existed in the background, waiting for something, a documentary, a news segment, a conversation, to bring them forward again. The story had become something more than a single event. It had become a reference point. A way to talk about uncertainty. About how people construct truth when the pieces never fully align. For some, the case remained closed. Scott Peterson had been tried, convicted, sentenced. The legal system had done its job. The outcome, while tragic, was clear. There was nothing left to question. But for others, the case never settled into that kind of finality. They revisited the evidence, not with the goal of overturning the verdict, but with the need to understand it. To see how each piece connected, how each conclusion was reached. They watched interviews, read transcripts, analyzed timelines. They looked for certainty and found, instead, layers. Layers of behavior. Layers of interpretation. Layers of meaning that did not always lead to the same place. The recordings between Scott and Amber Fry continued to draw attention. People listened to them not just for what was said, but for what seemed to be missing. The emotional tone, the lack of urgency, the inconsistencies, these elements were dissected repeatedly. To some, they were proof of guilt. To others, they were evidence of something else. Detachment. Immaturity. A personality that did not respond to crisis in a conventional way. The same details, interpreted differently, leading to entirely different conclusions. And that divide became part of the legacy of the case. Because it forced people to confront an uncomfortable reality. That evidence does not speak for itself. It is interpreted. Filtered through perception, through bias, through expectation. Two people can look at the same set of facts and arrive at completely different understandings. And both can feel certain they are right. The legal system, by necessity, must choose one conclusion. It cannot exist in uncertainty. But outside the courtroom, uncertainty can persist indefinitely. In 2020, when Scott Peterson's death sentence was overturned and replaced with life imprisonment without parole, the case returned to public attention once again. Headlines reappeared. Discussions reignited. The story, which had never fully disappeared, rose back into focus. For some, the change in sentence felt like a correction. For others, it felt like a disruption. But what it did most clearly was remind people that the case was still active in a legal sense, still moving through processes that most never see. Appeals. Reviews. Legal arguments that unfold slowly, often quietly, but with significant consequences. It reinforced the idea that a verdict is not always the end. Sometimes, it is just another stage. Meanwhile, the broader cultural impact of the case continued to grow. It became part of the true crime landscape, referenced alongside other cases that challenged the boundaries between evidence and narrative. It was studied, discussed, revisited in podcasts, documentaries, and books. Each retelling brought something slightly different, a new perspective, a different emphasis. Some focused on Lacey. On who she was, on the life she had been building, on the future that had been taken from her. Others focused on Scott. On his behavior, his psychology, the question of whether his actions revealed intent, or simply reflected a flawed character. And some focused on the system itself. On how cases are constructed, how juries interpret evidence, how narratives are built in the absence of direct proof. The story expanded beyond its original boundaries. It became less about a single event and more about what that event revealed. About people. About relationships. About the fragile line between appearance and reality. Because if there is one thread that runs consistently through this case, it is that nothing was as it appeared. A marriage that seemed stable. A husband who seemed composed. A life that seemed predictable. All of it fractured under closer examination. And that fracture is what continues to resonate. Because it challenges something fundamental. The belief that we can understand the people closest to us. That we can read intentions clearly. That we can trust appearances. The story of Lacey Peterson suggests otherwise. It suggests that there are layers beneath every surface. That people can exist in multiple realities at once. That what is visible is not always complete. And that sometimes, the truth is not hidden, because it is carefully concealed, but because it exists in pieces that do not easily fit together. As time moves forward, the case remains. Not in the same way it once did, not with the same urgency or intensity, but as something quieter, more reflective. A story that people return to not just for answers, but for understanding. For the chance to look again. To reconsider. To ask the same questions from a different angle. And perhaps, to accept that some questions do not have answers that feel complete. That some stories, no matter how thoroughly examined, retain an element of uncertainty. An absence that cannot be filled. Just as the absence left by Lacey Peterson cannot be filled. Her story does not end with the verdict. It continues in the way it is remembered. In the way it is discussed. In the way it lingers. Not as a closed chapter, but as something still being read, still being interpreted, still unfolding in the minds of those who encounter it. And in that sense, it remains alive. Not in the way anyone would have wanted, but in a way that ensures it is never entirely forgotten. Long after the courtroom emptied and the cameras disappeared, what remained was not just a case, but a shadow. It followed the memory of Laci Peterson in a way that felt almost inseparable from her name. For many, she was no longer just a person who had lived, loved, and hoped. She had become part of a narrative, one that people revisited not only to understand what happened, but to understand how something like this could happen at all. Because beneath the facts, beneath the timelines and testimonies, there was something more unsettling. A question that refused to settle. Not what happened, but how close was the truth to something we would never have seen coming. In the years that followed, those who had known Laci personally carried her memory in a very different way than the public did. To them, she was not a case. She was not evidence. She was not a symbol. She was a voice they could still hear in quiet moments, a presence that lingered in memories too specific to ever be replaced. The way she laughed at something small. The way she paused before speaking, choosing her words carefully. The way she seemed to create calm in spaces without trying. Grief, in that form, does not move forward cleanly. It loops. It returns. It attaches itself to dates, to seasons, to places. Every December, the weight would come back. Not because of the headlines, but because of the silence that followed them. Because Christmas, once associated with warmth and anticipation, had been permanently altered. It had become a marker of absence. A reminder of the moment everything stopped. For Laci's family, time did not erase that moment. It only placed distance around it. Enough distance to continue living, but not enough to disconnect from what had been lost. They spoke about her in fragments. Stories that began normally and ended abruptly. Memories that carried both comfort and pain. They remembered the way she had prepared for her son, how she had imagined his life before he even arrived. They remembered the details she had chosen, the care she had taken, the quiet certainty she had about the future. That future never came. And that absence, more than anything else, defined the emotional core of the case. Because while the world focused on the investigation, the trial, the evidence, there was a simpler truth beneath all of it. A life had been interrupted. A story had been cut short. And nothing that followed could restore what had been lost in that moment. At the same time, the figure of Scott Peterson remained fixed in a different kind of narrative. Not one of memory, but of interpretation. People continued to analyze him. Not just what he had done, but who he was. His behavior became a subject of ongoing scrutiny. Psychologists, criminologists, and commentators examined his actions through different lenses, trying to understand what kind of person could exist within the contradictions that defined him. A man who could appear calm while his wife was missing. A man who could maintain a relationship with another woman while presenting himself publicly as a grieving husband. A man whose emotional responses did not align with expectation. Some described him as calculating. Others as detached. Some saw manipulation. Others saw a kind of emotional absence that defied simple categorization. But none of these interpretations could fully explain what had happened. Because human behavior, especially in extreme circumstances, does not always fit into clear patterns. And that uncertainty kept the case alive in a different way. Not as an active investigation, but as an ongoing question. The relationship between Scott and Amber Fry continued to be one of the most examined aspects of the case. Not just because of what it revealed, but because of how it revealed it. Amber had not entered the story as part of a crime. She had entered it as part of Scott's life. And in doing so, she had unknowingly become a witness to a version of him that no one else had seen so clearly. Her recordings did not provide direct answers. They did not contain a confession. But they captured something more elusive. A tone. A distance. A way of speaking that suggested separation from reality. And in those details, people found meaning. Or tried to. Because meaning is something we seek, especially in situations that feel incomplete. We look for patterns. We connect behavior to outcome. We build narratives that help us understand what would otherwise remain chaotic. But sometimes, those narratives are not definitive. They are interpretations. And the story of Laci Peterson exists within that space. Between what is known and what is believed. Between what can be proven and what can only be inferred. As the years continued, the case became part of a larger conversation about true crime itself. About why people are drawn to these stories. About what it means to examine tragedy from a distance. Some argued that revisiting cases like this keeps the memory of victims alive. That it ensures they are not forgotten. Others questioned whether the focus on perpetrators, on their psychology and actions, risks overshadowing the lives that were lost. In the case of Laci, that tension is especially visible. Because her story is both deeply personal and widely public. She exists in two forms. As a woman who lived a quiet, meaningful life. And as a figure within one of the most widely discussed criminal cases of her time.